This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, with my very special featured guest today, Peter Janney, the author of Mary's Mosaic, which I regard as the single most extraordinary book ever to emerge from research on the assassination of JFK. Peter, during the course of his life, knew Mary Meyer, who had an intimate relationship with JFK and appears to have had a very positive influence upon his quest for peace in the world, than which nothing could be more desired, and even had the experience of sitting on her lap as a child. When he discovered she was dead, he was quite shocked, and it led to an investigation with rather startling results, including disclosures about his own father that had to have been personally extraordinarily painful. Peter is among my personal heroes. He has made extraordinary sacrifices and shown a remarkable dedication and intelligence. Indeed, I regard his book as completely brilliant. Here's the cover of the third edition of Mary's Mosaic. Peter, I can't thank you enough for joining me today.
Great to be with you again, Jim.
Real pleasure. Tell us just a bit of a sketch of the background about the death of Mary, because in my opinion, Peter, the reason your book is so extraordinary, I mean, among the other features where the personal connection, of course, integrates the entire work in a synthetic whole that is masterfully illuminating, is because you expose, through the study of this case, the techniques that the agency uses to construct assassinations, where they're controlling virtually every witness, every participant, but then lure innocent bystanders into witness scenes they don't truly understand to create false impressions based upon sincere testimony that makes it look as though the whole thing was on the up and up. I mean, this to me is the most extraordinary part of your expose, and why the agency undoubtedly fears your book and would do everything it could to suppress it.
Yes, I think that's true. You know, as one person told me, Jim, he said, you know, this book is like a new episode of Mission Impossible. You remember that TV show, right?
Sure.
And I mean, where they go through all the, logistics of planning out an operation that they're going to do. In much the same way, Mary's assassination was very, very similar to JFK's assassination. You had a patsy, you had a number of peripheral people who didn't know they were involved, but certainly quickly became involved, unknowingly so. And you had an agency team controlling the entire event, right up to the murder itself, and then right after the murder. So, we do get a kind of bird's eye view of how the CIA, one model of how the CIA operated in terms of doing this kind of assassination work. And it's really, I mean, it's incredible when you step back and you take a look at all the effort and planning that went into an event such as this.
Yes, and you unravel it so masterfully. The black man who was framed for Mary's murder would have undoubtedly been convicted had he not had the representation by an unusually able attorney. Could you comment on this aspect of how Ray Kroc escaped being convicted of a murder he did not commit?
Yes, the legendary African-American woman attorney, Dovie Roundtree, is still quite a figure in Washington, even though the Washington Post would never review the book that was written about her, which is one of the most beautifully written books, Justice Older Than the Law by Katie McCabe. She was just masterful in tearing this case apart from day one of the trial. And so when they got to the end of the trial, it was pretty clear as far as the jury was concerned that there just wasn't any evidence linking Mr. Crump to the murder scene, the body of Mary Meyer, or anything remotely so. And despite what the prosecution tried to do in terms of withholding evidence, any number of caveats in terms of trying to sabotage the defense's case, Attorney Roundtree prevailed in a way that even Jim Garrison couldn't. You know, I mean, she won that case in getting Ray Crump's acquittal.
Yes, yes, completely brilliant, absolutely admirable human being. I have enormous respect for her. Weren't you astonished when you put all the pieces together to realize how completely the scene, the passerbys and so forth were controlled by the agency, that virtually everyone on the scene was in fact working for the CIA?
Well, that is, you know, I could not say that in all veracity. For instance, the tow truck driver.
Well, he was lured in, though, Peter. The tow truck driver was lured in, and right. He was the innocent bystander who would testify sincerely to a scene that was set up for him to observe.
That's right. That's right. But I mean, I want your viewers to understand that, you know, he was not working for the agency.
No, of course he wasn't. Of course he wasn't.
But this is where the agency is so brilliant in terms of being able to set up situations like this where innocent bystanders do get lured in, and before they know it, they are part of, you know, an astounding scene that they never would wish upon their worst enemy.
Yeah. And of course, I mean, you might want to review the circumstances under which Mary was taken out. It was after the assassination of JFK, where James Jesus Angleton, the celebrated counter-espionage expert in the agency, was very keen in discovering what Mary knew in relation to JFK, his death, and particularly that she had a diary that the agency wanted to obtain. And they set her up for a hit on a walking path or a bike path by the river. And, you know, give us a sketch.
Well, Mary had as an artist, Mary had a routine that she pretty much stuck to every day that she worked. She would go to her studio early in the morning, getting there around 8 or 8:30. Her studio was in the back of Ben Bradley's house on N Street in Georgetown. It was a converted garage. And then along about noontime, she would stroll down into Georgetown, the little village, and walk across the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal on a bridge there and walk out the towpath to a place called Fletcher's Boathouse. It was about 1.5 miles out from Georgetown itself. And then she would turn around and walk back. And that was kind of her daily exercise routine. So she was under surveillance for quite a bit of time around the publication time of the Warren Commission, which was about September 24, 1964. And of course, she bought the paperback version and she, you know, went through it as best she could. She was outraged by what had been taking place. And she realized that not only had there been a conspiracy in Dallas, of which she had been writing about in her diary for the past year, there was now a second conspiracy of cover-up. And this was the juncture by which she decided that she was going to go public in Washington with who she was and what her relationship with JFK had been and what she and JFK had shared during the time that they were together. So this is not, you know, a fly-by-night floozy. Mary Meyer was a very well-known, very well-thought-of social person in the upper sort of echelons of Georgetown society. And were she to come out in this way, Jim, people would notice. I mean, people with a lot of credibility would, you know, begin to step back and say, wait a minute, maybe there is something here that the Warren Commission isn't telling us the whole truth, that kind of thing. And of course, as you know, what the Warren Commission did not need after it came out was a bunch of new critics jumping on the bandwagon, clamoring for a much more thorough, actual, real investigation, none of which they had during the time that they were creating the report. So it was at this point, her telephones were being monitored by Angleton and his boys. They realized what she was going to do, and the decision was made to take her out. And so less than about 2.5 weeks later, October 12th, 1964, it was a Monday. Cord Meyer was intentionally in New York, out of town. And of course, she knew about what was to take place. That was when they put the plan into motion. They monitored her that morning. They knew she was walking out on her usual run. Everything was all set up to take her down.
Yeah, appalling. And they must have known about Crump because they had a figure who was going to impersonate him. I mean, it's very strange how he'd had sex with a girlfriend of his there and fallen asleep and wound up in the water, which ironically turned out to be the salvation for his exoneration in court. Because
yes, and the thing to understand is, people have said to me, well, was Crump in on it? I mean, did they get to him beforehand? And my answer is no. But they were down there early in the morning. The murder didn't take until about 12:20 right after noon. So they picked out Crump, in my opinion, walking out the path with this girlfriend, and they decided, there's our patsy. Let's look at what he's wearing right now. Let's get the technical services division on this immediately. Let's duplicate the clothes. Let's either paint someone up as being African American, or if we have an African American agent, let's have him here right now. And they had probably 3 hours or more to nail down the logistics of what would eventually take place.
That's right. Find someone to stand in for him, wearing clothing like the clothing he was wearing at the time. And of course, the point I'm making about his falling in the water is that his clothing changed after he'd fallen in the water. He didn't look like he had looked earlier in the morning, which I think was extremely important in Dovey's defense.
Yes, and of course, when Crump was arrested, he didn't have his jacket and cap. But of course, they knew he was wearing that earlier in the morning. So there's a number of discrepancies in the trial transcript as to how did the police patrol out on the Potomac River know to look for the jacket or cap when he wasn't arrested, wearing these items.
Yes.
There are a number of little,
yes.
clues, that if you study the transcript long enough, it's right there, and you can see the kind of machinations that went in to create this, it was a brilliant plan. I mean, there's no two ways about it.
Now, when you first learned of Mary's death, and you were very young at the time, were you struck by your father's seeming detachment from, emotionally from the demise of someone who had actually been a friend of the family and whom you had known so well as to sit in her lap?
Well, the answer to your question is yes, although not immediately. I came home from boarding school the day before Thanksgiving in 1964. I had not known that Mary had been murdered. I was intentionally not told that by my parents. I don't know why exactly. They probably didn't want to upset me in some way. So this was just sort of casually announced the night before Thanksgiving at dinner. And my mother did all the talking. My father didn't say one word. Instead, he was sort of staring vacantly off into space. And I do remember noticing the fact that he was not saying anything. I didn't really make that much of it at the moment because I was just so bludgeoned by the starkness of what my mother had told me. It took me actually years before I was able to go back and just go back through scene by scene at that dinner table and start remembering every little detail and connecting it with every little visceral feeling at the time. And as a training clinical psychologist, this is the kind of thing you have to do to be a good clinician. So I certainly had material to work with, and it was really over the course of many years subsequent to that day before Thanksgiving in 1964 that all the pieces started coming together, and I was really able to begin to, put the pieces of the puzzle in their proper place.
And your age at the time was?
17.
17.
Yes.
Well, of course, putting two and two together, but it had such a powerful emotional impact, you would not forget the circumstances under which you learned that she had been killed. And, it's remarkable that you determined to figure out what had happened to Mary. I think that is absolutely fascinating, that your dedication, your affection for her, and your feeling that there was something here you did not understand, your desire to put together the pieces that led to this extraordinary exploration with such stunning results.
Well, that's a very accurate description, Jim. And, it was not something that happened in an immediate way. In 1976, the National Enquirer article came out that exposed Mary's affair with JFK. Up until that time, it had been a well-hidden secret in Washington. Only a few of her friends and Ben Bradley knew about it. They agreed to keep it under wraps. But this guy, Jim Truitt, who Bradley had fired from the Washington Post, decided to go public with it, having been a close friend of Mary's himself with his wife Ann Truitt. And so the Enquirer did this expose in 1976, and that's when, all the bells and whistles and sirens started to go off in me. What is going on here? And of course, I, at that time, really got no assistance from anyone in my family around this, but I just kept thinking, there's something that's not being revealed here. And it kept gnawing at me. I wouldn't say that I had nightmares about it, but I did have a number of vivid dreams. One well-known intuitive told me that, this was both Mary and Jack Kennedy trying to communicate with me to sort of awaken to me what had happened. I didn't really get into studying the JFK assassination until much later. I would say it started in the early 1980s. And little by little, as I started reading a number of really good books, I remember Dick Russell's book, The Man Who Knew Too Much. All the stuff that had gone on in Dealey Plaza that was coming out. That's when the gears started really turning inside me. That being said, there were still several doors that I had to open in terms of coming to terms with myself and making a commitment to take this on. Because if I was going to take it on, I had to commit to taking it all the way to the end. And in order to do that, I realized, wait a minute, I am entering into a place of real danger here. Do I want to do this? And furthermore, if I do it, what would happen to my wife? What would happen if I had a family? Why wouldn't, they be threatened as well? And the more I went into that place, I realized if I'm going to do this, I cannot have a family. I would never be able to live with myself if something had happened to either a spouse or a child of mine. It just would have ruined me for the rest of my life. So I finally made the commitment. I was engaged at the time. I broke the engagement. I went off on my own and said, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to walk through this door, and I am going to make a commitment to take this to the very end. And, it's been a lonely battle sometimes, but I would say at this point, Jim, it's so very, very important for people, particularly in this day and age, to know the truth of what our real history is. Because it's only in knowing the truth that we as individuals and as a country can go forward in a way where we can truly evolve as people and as a nation in terms of taking our heads out of the sand, taking our heads out of denial, and facing what has happened in the hopes that perhaps if we do, it will not happen again. And that is a critically important event to take on.
Well, you take my breath away, Peter. I so admire you, the sacrifices you have made to pursue the truth. When you were an undergraduate at Princeton, I presume you studied psychology. Did you study history or philosophy as well?
I was technically a psychology major, but my real passion was history. And I was very fortunate to have Martin Duberman as one of my primary teachers and advisors, who, as you're probably well aware of, is a very left-leaning historian. And he, I think, was single-handedly responsible for just helping me to understand that history is not etched in stone. It's written by historians, and historians have biases from the very beginning. And so it was under his tutelage that I really began to look at things quite a bit differently. I was also going to college in the late 60s. The Vietnam War was raging. I became a rabid anti-Vietnam War protester to the point of being arrested a number of times. Of course, this enraged my parents, both of them. But what else was I supposed to do? The injustice that we were facing was just, I mean, it was ubiquitous. It had to be confronted. And so that too was, part of my own personal transformation to move this along.
Well, of course, I was commissioned as a lieutenant in the Marine Corps on graduation from Princeton in 1962 and served for 4 years, resigning my commission as a captain in 1966. My brother was a conscientious objector. I believe his draft board was astonished when they received a letter from a regular commissioned officer in the Marine Corps attesting to his sincerity. And by a divided vote, he was classified as a conscientious objector. I believe that from an historical point of view, Nixon's decision to abolish the draft, which was intended, of course, to eviscerate the pressure he was under from the anti-war movement, has had extraordinarily damaging effects to the nation, because no longer do parents and families worry about decisions of war and peace, because they're going to let others do it. They know their own sons and daughters are not at risk unless they were to volunteer, which they would oppose vehemently. And as a consequence, I believe the executive branch has been able to exert far much to influence in getting the United States into a succession of wars of aggression, especially in the Middle East, that are staining our reputation forever, Peter. This is the most disgraceful conduct in the history of the United States, and that's saying something.
I could not agree with you more, Jim. I think Nixon was brilliant in making this move. He didn't want any more well-educated, snot-nosed college kids gumming up the works in terms of American military power, so he made it look like he was doing everyone a favor, when in fact it was a very calculated move on his part and the entire national security apparatus.
It observed the complete dearth of college protests over the wars in the Middle East. I mean, we're slaughtering millions of people for no good reason. Actually, inspired by 9/11, was brought to us by the CIA, the neocons in the Department of Defense, and the Mossad. This was to transform our foreign policy so we would become an aggressor nation. Heretofore, we'd never attacked any nation that had not attacked us first. By suggesting it was terrorists, elusive, shadowy group, we could justify attacking virtually any country. Wesley Clark would eventually explain at the Commonwealth Club the plan was to take out 7 governments in the next 5 years, beginning with Iraq and Libya, ending with Syria and Iran. And if it hasn't played out that way because of Russian intervention at the request of the government of Syria, it's not been for lack of trying. But there's been no protest. No protest, Peter. To me, it's dumbfounding.
Well, yes, it's been tragic. There's just no two ways around that, Jim. I do think I see the seeds of change that are going to take place after this election cycle is over. I do think there is going to be a rush of new enthusiasm, not just around these imperialist wars that our country keeps propagating, but a whole host of other individuals, to say the least, climate change, which is going to affect everyone. I'm hopeful. On the other hand, I also think that to get to the point where we are right now, it's absolutely essential that we hit rock bottom, to the point where people have to be, in a sense, threatened in their own individual world to wake up and look around and see what's happening and understand what the stakes are. I mean, it's everywhere now.
Well, our situation is completely artificial, contrived. The media are running as propaganda organs. The polls are rigged. There's a tremendous support for change. And for all of his warts, and he has many, Donald Trump has upended the establishment. He's created chaos in politics in America. And because of the ongoing efforts to smear him, the people are seeing the extent to which they have been subjected to manipulation through the information wars. Bernie Sanders had his campaign sabotaged by the DNC. I mean, anyone who thinks these elections can't be rigged hasn't been paying attention, and it's absolutely stunning, Peter. My fear, and we already have reports of votes being switched in Texas, for example, voting straight Republican and finding out that your vote was cast for Hillary Clinton instead. I mean, this is just the tip of an enormous iceberg, where the Rothschilds and the CIA have their candidate in Hillary Clinton, and they're going to do everything they can, use every resource at their disposal to get her in office. Where Hillary has even been observed to say, when she was outraged with her own staff, after Matt Lauer asked her a question that she had not personally already vetted about her improper use of her email server, that if we lose this election, we'll all have our heads in a noose, and you'll be to blame because of this. I mean, it was an extraordinary event, which has now been, the report about it has been observed by more than a million, and it's going to go higher. But we have finally reached a point, I think, as you're observing, the bottom, absolute pit bottom of the barrel, Peter, with corruption and propaganda and the abuse of the public and the betrayal of the press of its sacred duty to inform the public of what's going on. It's astounding.
Well, and so, Jim, let's take this back to where the genesis of this problem began. I think it's post-World War II with this new bureaucracy called the Central Intelligence Agency. I mean, people were warning back then. David Bruce, there's another gentleman that a Princeton man, I forget his name, very high up, who warned Truman that if you create this new agency, there's a real likelihood that it's going to become the new American Gestapo. And of course, Truman was just repulsed by JFK's assassination, writing the op-ed piece that he did for the Washington Post exactly 1 month to the day after the assassination, complaining vociferously that the CIA had taken this covert action arm and were, in a sense, creating their own foreign policy without any awareness on the part of the United States Congress of what the hell it was doing. I mean, and we just watched this go on. No one had the political will to stand up and demand accountability. And that's got to change.
When Osama bin Laden was first asked about 9/11, he explained he had nothing to do with it. In fact, he was our man in Afghanistan. He was working for the agency. He was Colonel Tim Osman, instrumental in getting the Stinger missiles into the hands of the resistance in Afghanistan. that drove the Soviet Union out by shooting down so many of its helicopters and gunships. But he said there's a government within the government of the United States that wanted to blame this on Muslims. We find the same sentiment echoed by no less than William Jefferson Clinton, who also said there was a government within the government and that he does not control it. And I think that part of the importance of your work is to expose how deeply the CIA has been involved, especially in this instance, in the removal of a one true great peace president we actually have ever had, who is advancing the interests of the people of the United States, wanting to circumvent or abolish the Fed, for example, which has been an instrumentality that's been used to corrupt the United States. Or the Baron de Rothschild observed that if I control the money of a country, I care not who makes the laws. And we have seen that come to fruition. And through his opposition to the CIA threatening to shatter it into 1,000 pieces, his decision to get ourselves out of the war in Vietnam, which brought the Joint Chiefs into participating in the assassination. Peter, you have just done this extraordinary thing, and I want to, in relation to your book, we now have the third edition. I know there are parts there, a new chapter from the second and a new chapter in the third, and I'd like you to address first the new edition from the second, where you pursued the man who actually you were able to sort out had murdered Mary Meyer.
No, he did not murder Mary Meyer. I want to make that very clear, because that really is not correct. He was part of the conspiracy team, but he was not the actual assassin. And, look, just like Jim Garrison believed that it really wasn't important to know the actual shooters of JFK, we're never going to know who the actual CIA assassin or professional assassin was of Mary Meyer. But we do know that this was a conspiratorial effort, that there were a number of people involved, and Lieutenant William Mitchell had a role. His role was to be, allegedly, because we don't know for sure, but allegedly on the towpath that morning and framing Ray Crump, whom he said he ran by after he ran by Mary Meyer just a few minutes before her death. When the first edition came out in April 2012, I had been unsuccessful in locating this guy, William Mitchell. He couldn't be found. And I had one of the best military intelligence researchers alive today, this guy, Lieutenant Colonel Roger Charles, a retired Marine colonel who's he was featured in the movie Truth with Robert Redford and Cate Blanchett. He was portrayed by a very well-known actor, Dennis Quaid. Roger worked with me for close to 7 years to figure some of these things out, and we were stumped back in 2012. However, after the book came out, someone brought a particular detail to our attention as to who this guy Mitchell was or where he was, and I picked up the scent of the trail, and we realized, okay, he went to Cornell, he went to Harvard, got a master's degree to Harvard, he then went to Berkeley and got a PhD, and we located him. And so 4 months after the first edition came out, I walked up to his house in August of 2012 and knocked on his door. And when he answered and I told him who I was, and I had a copy of the book under my arm, and I was also secretly recording our encounter, he became, which he did not know, he became immediately hostile. He was just very, very upset that I had found him. And of course, yelled at me, and I pleaded with him to at least just talk to me. He shut the door in my face, and I said, okay, that's the end of it. But at least I located him, and I had the recording to prove that. I couldn't let it go, Jim, at that. I had to figure out, how am I going to entice this guy out into the open? So I went and had a meeting with William Pepper, the legendary attorney who, went to the Martin Luther King civil trial and proved that the government had been very much involved in King's assassination. A very wonderful man who is just very courageous in so many different respects. And I told him the story. I gave him a copy of the book, and I hired him to say, give me a strategy for, taking this a next step with this guy, Mitchell. And he said, well, what you have to do is you have to take him to court in a civil lawsuit, and so we could do that. You'll have to take him to court in Washington. And so we wrote out a complaint. I was what was called a plaintiff ad litem, but it was a very iffy kind of situation. Very likely, the case would have been thrown out of court had we pursued it, in a Washington courtroom. But Mitchell was so upset when he was served with the complaint that he got a lawyer. And the lawyer, called up Pepper and said, look, this is, you can't do this, da, 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 da. And Pepper said, oh, yes, we can. And this is what we're going to do. And finally, he said, well, look, what about if, would Mr. Janney agree to just a deposition? I'll allow you to depose my client for as long as you need to. You drop the case, we'll do that. And so when I thought about this, Jim, I realized, I could go into a Washington, D.C. courtroom. This guy could stroll in with a squeaky clean military service record that I have not been able to locate, and the judge would take one look at it and say, case dismissed. At least this way, I will have an opportunity to confront him. So we did the deposition in January of 2014. It's posted online on the Mary's Mosaic website. You can read it for yourself. But it's so clear in this deposition that this guy is not telling the truth, pure and simple. And so after the deposition, at the end of the deposition, I said, well, look, I think it is probably clear that Mr. Mitchell is not the assassin, because they were very upset that I had made that accusation in the first edition. And I said, okay, I'll take a look at this again and we'll see what we can do. Of course, I did not want to get sued, but the statute of limitations for them had already run out on whether they could get me on defamation. But I also wanted to get to the truth, Jim. That was really, my main reason for pushing forward on this. So after the deposition, we were able to finally locate Lieutenant Mitchell's military service number. And with that number, that's what started to open up a treasure trove of documents about his military career. However, the Army and the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis wouldn't release the most, juiciest stuff, even though I was entitled to it through the Freedom of Information Act. So it was at that point that I had to go out and hire a hired gun lawyer who was very successful at this kind of thing. And I was on the verge of suing the United States Army to release this documents when they finally called up my new attorney and said, oh, Mr. Bodney, guess what? We were able to finally find the documents that we thought we never had. And so they turned over everything, and we, spent several months reviewing the documents, putting it all together, all of which are posted on the website now. And it's clear Mr. Mitchell had intelligence connections. So by way of government documents, we have now pretty much made a very strong case that Mr. Mitchell was working as an intelligence asset on the morning of Mary Meyer's murder. And of course, the day after the murder, he goes to the police and says, I think I ran by this woman yesterday. And oh, by the way, there was this black guy following her, and this is what he was wearing, And of course, his description matched what Ray Crumps had been the day before when he was arrested. And, the DC police thought, oh man, game, set, and match. We finished our investigation. It's clear Crump did it. And of course, no one thought to really ask, wait a minute, who is this guy, William Mitchell? What is he really doing? And that's what this final edition is about. That's what the final chapter in the book is about in terms of unraveling this little enigma and finally bringing it into the light of day.
Further, very substantial confirmation of the CIA's involvement in taking her out and the way in which they orchestrate. They even have a key witness who just happens to put the crucial elements together, and everyone presumes he's a legit, but in fact, it's just taking for granted something that requires independent verification. Indeed, you have falsified that claim. Peter, I must ask, for those who have never read your book, how did you come to the agonizing realization that your own father, who was an official with the agency, had been involved not only in the death of Mary Meyer, but in that of JFK as well?
Well, again, Jim, that was sort of part of my own emerging mosaic around this process. I mean, there did come a time when I was researching the book, I believe it was about 2011 or 12, when I woke up very early one morning. It was still dark. I felt that, there was someone else in my apartment, but there wasn't anyone there, but I felt there were these voices going on in my head. I knew I wasn't going crazy, but then what immediately came up was that my own father had called Ben Bradley very shortly after the murder took place. And he called up Bradley and he said, "Ben, are you listening to the radio?" And Ben said, "No, Wister, I'm at work. Why would I be listening to the radio?" "Well, there's been a shooting on the towpath. This woman, they don't know who it is. And by the sound of it, it could be Mary. Do you know where Mary is?" And of course, this was my father's way of getting Bradley immediately involved. Ray Crump had already been arrested at the time of his phone call. And basically the CIA was buttoning up the case at that point. My father was performing this role that Jim Angleton, even though he was much, much closer to Cord Meyer, couldn't perform because it would look too suspicious. Of course, my father called Cord Meyer right after he called Ben Bradley to tell him what had happened, and of course, Cord Meyer writes about that in his memoir, saying how sad a moment it was, da-da-da-da-da. But, this was all pre-planned, Jim. I mean, this was the way it was set up to make it look like something that it wasn't. And it was at that point that I really began to put two and two together, that my father was not only involved in the conspiracy to cover up the JFK assassination, as that document in Appendix 5 shows, but he was one of the primary conspirators in Mary Meyer's death.
That must have been devastating for you, Peter, emotionally, to find your own father involved in this.
It was, on another level, Jim, it was also a relief. But I will definitely say right here and right now, I had to just stop working on the story and the book for a month or two. I was smart enough to say, look, if I don't do something on my own behalf right now, I'm going to lose this. And I put myself back in psychotherapy immediately and just went to work on this. I had to have someone I could talk to about this each week in terms of what was going on. And it saved me. I mean, not only am I a mental health professional, I am also a mental health advocate, because, there are times when mental health services are critically important for anyone. And in this case, it was my turn.
Well, it had to have been an emotional catastrophe for you to discover your own father was so deeply implicated in these monstrous crimes.
Yes, it was. I'm not mitigating that dimension at all. But there's also, an even stronger impulse here, Jim, to know the truth. And if one is not afraid to confront the truth and just face whatever the real reality is, which I am a huge proponent of, as you can see, one is not leading the kind of life that I would care to lead. So yes, it was terribly devastating. It was deeply upsetting. It was also, finally, I'm getting to the bottom of this, and basically, understanding who my father was and who he wasn't. There are many other dimensions to my father that I also applaud. I mean, he was a World War II Navy pilot, won the Navy Cross, just looked up death's rectum on a number of times in the Battle of Leyte Gulf in the Pacific. I mean, I admired him for things like that. And a lot of these early CIA people had those kinds of experiences in World War II. And they came back from the war wanting to make sure that we can never allow another world war to take place, because now it would be nuclear. And of course, from my point of view, many of the brightest people, Cord Meyer being one, even to some extent Jim Angleton, they were all seduced by Alan Dulles, who I think is just the reincarnation of Machiavelli. I mean, this guy is the quintessential evil Darth Vader of the Cold War. And it's only until recently that David Talbot's book, The Devil's Chessboard, has told us the real story about who Alan Dulles was.
Well, I'm at one with you in being a truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth kind of guy. I'm not willing to compromise on the truth. And it's cost me in relationships, other opportunities, who knows? But if we cannot have the truth, we have nothing. We cannot live in a world of illusion, sleepwalk through history, and be responsible agents and actors in this world. Was there ever an occasion, Peter, when you had the opportunity to confront your father about this, what you'd unearthed about his involvement in these activities?
No, because my father died very early. He was only 59 years old. He died in 1979. We were already quite estranged from one another over Vietnam. He was, of course, very, very upset that I had taken the position that I did on Vietnam, when I was in college and after college. And so our relationship had really ended. There was never a real opportunity for us to reconcile. And I think, given what I know now, it would have been almost impossible had I presented him with the evidence that I finally put together.
In relation to Talbot's book, Peter, I've been very concerned that it was intended to shift the focus off of the true principal in the assassination, Lyndon Johnson, onto Alan Dulles. I have no doubt Dulles was involved in the background in the planning, and he and his brother had an enormous impact on the role of the United States in world affairs that was very much, on balance, negative for world history. But Lyndon forced himself on the ticket in Los Angeles in 1960. He threatened to expose that JFK had had dalliances with women who were spies for East Germany, that he suffered from Addison's disease, that if he were not on the ticket, that he'd bottle up any legislative proposals from the White House that would be dead on arrival. Bobby and Jack tried to figure a way out of it, but could find none, and were forced to accede to his demands when a supporter of Johnson burst into the suite at the hotel, complaining that he'd betrayed them by running with JFK. Bobby Baker took him into a bedroom and explained what they had in mind. He came out all smiles and said he thought that was an excellent plan. Bobby Baker would later say that JFK would not live out his term and would die a violent death. Lyndon even sent his chief administrative assistant, Cliff Carter, down to Dallas to make sure all the arrangements were in place for the assassination. So my complaint about the Talbot book is that while it's brilliant in detail, that it seems to me to shift too much of the burden for the death of JFK onto Alan Dulles when it properly belongs on LBJ and only secondarily on Dulles.
Well, I'm undecided about that, Jim. I'm not sure LBJ, really had the means to, engineer the assassination. I mean, what about all the medical evidence in terms of controlling the autopsy, changing the wounds? I just, for the life of me, I don't think Johnson had the means to cover up all these other bases. Plus, on the very day of the assassination, as you know, there was a Senate subcommittee going on, a hearing going on with, the allegations of Johnson taking bribes in the Bobby Baker scandal. I mean, Life magazine was already putting together an expose on what was going to happen to Johnson. I think he was possibly headed for a criminal indictment.
Well, that's why JFK had to be taken out before it was published, Peter. You're ignoring the role of the timing here. Lyndon lured Jack to Dallas to have him whacked. It was very elaborate. I've been able to identify the 6 of the shooters, the shots they fired, the effects they had. Lyndon was the one person in the position to guarantee that no one who was involved in the assassination would ever pay a price for their participation. He would schmooze with the Secret Service at the White House. He would fester. He would develop their antipathy toward JFK because of his dalliances with many women and so forth. There are more than 15 indications of Secret Service complicity in setting him up for the hit. This was not Allen Dulles at work. This was Lyndon Johnson who had the power to do it. But, Peter, let us return to your stunning book and talk about Appendix 5, which you mentioned, which is a remarkable document. I'd like you to address it, and especially its meaning in relation to your father's involvement, the CIA, and the Jim Garrison investigation immortalized in Oliver Stone's magisterial film, JFK.
Well, I think that document, I finally, put that in, and I do take it on in the final chapter of the book as well. What that document shows in Appendix 5, Jim, is that the CIA was very, very worried about what Jim Garrison was doing. They knew, for instance, Clay Shaw had worked for the agency. And in that meeting, that's what the document discusses. As I mentioned to you before, Ray Roca, who my father outlines in point number 3, is in attendance at the meeting. He's Jim Angleton's chief lieutenant in the counterintelligence division. And he says very explicitly, and my father says, in a sense, rewrites what he says, that Garrison, quote unquote, will indeed get a conviction of Clay Shaw. And the reason he says that is because they all know Clay Shaw worked for the agency, which by the next rational implication implicates the CIA itself in the assassination itself. So several lawyer friends have looked at that document and told me that they consider it to be prima facie evidence that the CIA was involved in the JFK assassination. And I'm just shocked that they were stupid enough to let that document come out.
That's absolutely fascinating, yes. 3 key points. Executive director said the director had asked him to convene a group to consider the possible implications for the agency emanating from New Orleans before, during, and after the trial of Clay Shaw. 2, general counsel discussed his dealings with justice and the desire of Shaw's attorneys to make contact with the agency. 3, Roca felt that Garrison would indeed obtain a conviction of Shaw for conspiring to assassinate President Kennedy. And it follows as a point of logic that that is a concession that there was a conspiracy to assassinate the president, and indeed, by implication, that the agency was involved precisely the points you are making, which is indeed stunning. I mean, those who doubt there are smoking guns in the assassination of JFK, which is completely ridiculous because there are dozens upon dozens of them, this one is especially striking, and from a legal point of view, that it should make assertions that are so central to the case against the government for the death of our 35th president.
Very well said, Jim. I think it's too bad a number of other JFK researchers have not picked up on this. But that document, it's not just a smoking gun; it's a smoking cannon, for Christ's sake. I mean, it's a real critical piece of evidence, and of course, it's signed by my own father. So it again should tell everyone, about not only the CIA's role in what took place in Dallas, but they're just out and out lying over the course of 50 years about, who they really are and what they're really up to. The other little tidbit here is that I actually remember that time, or there about that time, because I had come home from a weekend from Princeton, and I believe it was right after the 27th of September 1967, which is the date of that meeting. And I remember just mentioning very casually to my father, sort of trying to make conversation. I said, wow, this guy Jim Garrison is reopening the Kennedy case. And Dad, he says the CIA was involved. At which point my father became apoplectic and just went into a tirade that I should even hold such a thought. I mean, I was really taken aback by the intensity of his response. Of course, I was also at that time understanding a little bit about, people with alcoholic impulse control, what they occasionally do. And my father's temper was famous in terms of his unleashing it. But I have always remembered that event. And then, of course, when I looked at the document and started remembering, when that meeting took place, it's very, very close to that encounter that I had with my father at that time.
Well, Peter, I cannot begin to express my admiration to you for your dedication and perseverance. This has been a personal journey that has led to staggering insights into the operation of the Central Intelligence Agency, and a tremendous personal expense to you. I recommend your book as a litmus test for JFK investigators. Perhaps the most striking conversation I had with Gordon Duff, who was then the editor-in-chief of Veterans Today while I was a journalist, about the agency was, I said to him, Gordon, I think 50% of those in the JFK community are working the other side. And he said, no, Jim, it's 90. And indeed, my own research has vindicated that that is indeed the case, that 90% of those in the JFK community are actually working for the government to suppress the truth, to obfuscate, to distort it. Recall, the objective of disinformation is not to convince anyone one way or the other, but to create enough uncertainty. As Marty Schatz observed in his book, History Will Not Absolve Us, that everything is believable and nothing is knowable. It seems to me you cut through it all right to the heart of the matter, and that anyone, from my point of view, who attacks your book, who does not have endless admiration for what you have accomplished here, has thereby revealed themselves to be a part of the 90%. So I mean it absolutely as a touchstone, as an acid test of integrity of those in the 9/11, in the JFK research community. Their attitude toward your book tells me all I need to know about them, Peter. I must tell you, it is the ultimate litmus test of sincerity and dedication to truth in the investigation of the death of JFK.
Well, Jim, that's very kind of you. Thank you very much for that observation. But, before we stop, I would just like to bring one other little tidbit up. And someone once said to me very recently, he said, look, why assassinate President Kennedy in broad daylight with thousands of witnesses and then go through all the work of covering it up? Why not just do it, more easily, make it look like an accident or whatever, And I had to think about this for a moment, and the answer that I and a number of other people have come up with, and I think your input on this will be good, is that this was done to serve as a deterrent to anyone who would try and follow in JFK's footsteps to knock down the war machine or put us on a path toward peace. So they had to kill him in broad daylight in a public execution to serve as a deterrent for other presidents. And if you remember, not too long ago, President Obama was in California, and someone asked him sort of off the cuff, well, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you close Guantanamo? And his off the cuff remark was, do you remember what happened to JFK?
That's quite striking, Peter. I would only add that they had to do it in public because killing a president isn't the hard part. That can be done relatively effortlessly, but killing him and getting away with it and pinning it on someone else, indeed the precise opposite of the parties that actually were responsible, that's the difficult part. And JFK died, for example, in the middle of the night in the White House. No one would have believed that it was not a conspiracy. So it was an essential element to the cover-up that it had to be done in a public way, in this case in Dealey Plaza, with a couple of hundred witnesses, but where they could control the body, they could subject it to manipulation, they could alter the x-rays, they could take the photos and videos and completely rework them to conceal what actually had happened. And by and large, they were terribly successful and managed to try to thwart the critics who were making obvious points, falsifying the official account by characterizing them as conspiracy theorists, thereby shifting the burden of proof, as though those who were pointing out that the Warren Commission report in certain crucial respects was indispensable had the obligation to explain exactly what had happened in every detail, lest they not be taken seriously. It was a very clever move. I think it's worn thin by this point in time, but look how much even those who talk about rigging the election are being described as conspiracy theorists to this day, my friend.
Right. Very well put, Jim. I think that's a great observation on your part.
And Peter, I must say I have boundless admiration for you, and I cannot thank you enough for taking this opportunity to share your time with me and with the world. I'm just enormously in your debt, Peter. Thank you so very much. I am grateful for your dedication and your sacrifice.
Thank you for having me, Jim. It's been great to be with you and your viewers. I hope that many people will find what we discussed today as highly instructive in terms of their understanding.
This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, thanking my special guest, Peter Janney, for being here. Get his book. Thank you all for watching.